Yeah, so just I'll give a couple warnings, but hopefully um, we don't have any young children on, and if we do, I do recommend that you use some discretion on this because we're going to be talking about crisis, and people tend to not be as articulate when they're in crisis and tend to use foul language. We'll also be talking about some very serious subjects. So I do recommend young adults and above for the presentation. But I do want, with that said, as we move forward, if you have any questions at any point, feel free to ask. This tends to work best as a discussion. So I'll start off with a clip that brings memories back to me about my first experience with hostage negotiating. Okay, well, thankfully that was an actor and he didn't get hurt. My first experience in negotiations happened to be back in 1999. Not partying like 1999, but definitely 1999. We had at the time with Raleigh 73 trained negotiators. And with my luck, none of them were working. And we had a hostage situation. Um, Now, I do have to apologize for my dark sense of humor. In law enforcement, as you probably know, you either laugh or you cry about some dark things. So none of it is meant disrespectful. It is a way to cope with some of the things that we see in law enforcement and at crisis. Tony, your mic is open if you want to just mute it for now, but feel free to jump in at any point. Um, So with all of that said, we had this hostage situation. It involves an estranged husband and his wife and kids. They were in an apartment. It was close to the area that I patrolled. I responded. And when I got there, my sergeant said, "Hey, Ben, you're smart. You went to college. Get on the bullhorn here and talk the guy out." Now, my training in hostage negotiating was extremely limited at that point. Probably had 2 hours of some sort of training um, up to that point where talked about what crisis was, how to de-escalate things, those kind of things. I was pulling from things like lethal weapon and all sorts of bad things saying, you don't want to be on the 5 o'clock news, do you? Really trying to jump right into problem solving, not at all doing any type of active listening, de-escalation, anything that trained negotiators do. Now, thankfully, the estranged wife overheard my ridiculous attempts at negotiating and took it upon herself to save her kids and save herself, escape out the back window while the subject was yelling back at me with every curse word possible, and rightfully so. I had no reason to be on that bullhorn, but afterwards, my sergeant said, "Oh, Baughman, that was fantastic. There's some training coming up that I think you would enjoy. It's an 8-hour introduction to negotiating for the first responder. I think you'd enjoy it." Now, it wasn't until I made sergeant many years later that I realized that conversation meant you're a liability. There's training coming up that you really should take, rather than the way I took it at the time, like, was he really at the same place I was? With that said, though, I went on to get into this whole negotiating thing. I went to the 8-hour class taught by, at the time, he was Sergeant Fluke, retired Captain Fluke, who was taught by Frank Boltz. And that's one of the two founding fathers of hostage negotiating in the early 70s that we're going to talk about. I've been fortunate enough to have over 300 hours of negotiating training. I've been able to train with the FBI. Scotland Yard, I got to train with them briefly for a period of a week that I was there working on my master's dissertation. And so I'll discuss just a little bit of how they're trained and the perspective that they come from. And Canadian Mounted Police, North Carolina SBI, and several other local agencies. I've been involved with over 30 incidents of barricaded and hostage situations over those 13 years. Then I went on, after finishing up my PhD, I taught for the state of North Carolina for 4 years, the hostage negotiating.
The other one.
Now, Jill, do you have a question? No? Okay. And it's okay if you guys have a question at any time, you can jump in, it's not a problem. My master's thesis, it was on hostage negotiating at the University of Liverpool, where I did move over to Liverpool, took a leave of absence from the Raleigh Police Department for 12 months to work on that master's, and then started my PhD under Dr. Cantor's supervision, part-time at first, and eventually the reason I left Raleigh PD was to move back to the United Kingdom to finish my PhD under Dr. David Cantor. My master's thesis, basically, the short of it is, there was 10 years of data that I used, a population of all the reported hostage and barricaded situations that we had. And then from that, I pulled out just the successful negotiations to look at behavioral backgrounds of people that were involved, to see if there was any correlation with their criminal history. And what the method showed was that people with a violent criminal history, a violent felony criminal history, took 3 times longer than anybody else, any other type of background. So people that had some violent, like simple assault, things that weren't at the felony level, where you could be in prison for a year or more in prison if you're found guilty, along with people with property crime, and then also just people with no crimes. Most of those incidents were related to warrant service that then became barricaded situations, followed by domestic violence situations. And then over the course of my time with Raleigh, I was awarded several honors for my role in different negotiations. One with a guy that his plan was to come to Raleigh, kill his girlfriend, ex-girlfriend at that point, and then kill himself. Unfortunately for him, and fortunately for her, he wasn't able to find her and was going to jump off the bridge into oncoming traffic on our Beltline. Long story short, I ended up going tactical with him, grabbing him on the bridge and getting him back over on the proper side of the bridge before 3 other Raleigh police officers turned into linemen and came at us to help the momentum. My foot got stuck and I broke my ankle, my right ankle on that case. So a lot of different incidents, and we'll talk about those as we go. But where did all this start? I did briefly want to mention Munich. So Munich in 1972. Okay, so just to bring this around now, we take negotiations in law enforcement almost for granted now, as if it's always been around. In 1972, this was unheard of to negotiate with terrorism. There's 13 Arab terrorists that stormed the Olympic compound that housed the Israel Olympic athletes, where they took 11 hostages. 200, their demands were to release 200 Arab prisoners in Israel that they wanted to be released. And also they wanted transportation to Egypt. So those were their demands. Their threats, if they didn't have those demands met, was to kill 2 athletes if the demands weren't met immediately. And then if transportation was not arranged, all hostages were going to be killed. At the time, Egypt's president refused to become involved in the situation. So the issues that came up from this was that you had alternatives suggested by the diplomats that were trying to problem solve. They weren't, this is before we understood the negotiation process, understood when things don't go, a particular way that people want them to go, when they're in crisis, or some version of that when they're amped up. The alternatives that they suggested was free passage to the Far East, payment of some money, or even trading hostages for other personnel. Now, the terrorists continued to insist on the release of all 200 Arab prisoners and that transportation to Egypt. The police observed what they thought were 2 dead athletes and then 9 others that were bounded. The terrorists continued to threaten 2 to kill 2 hostages if that transportation was not arranged for them. And that's when there was transportation that was arranged and movement to the airport. Now, the plans being made to move the terrorists and the hostages to the airport involved a bus. But during the move, the terrorists demanded to change from the bus to a helicopter and be flown to the airport. When they arrived at the airport, there were 4 terrorists that took some of the hostages with them to get off the helicopter and go towards the plane. The remaining group of terrorists and hostages were left in the helicopter. Now, this is when a tactical response took place because at 11 p.m., the police demanded that the terrorists drop their weapons and surrender. One of the terrorists immediately responded by throwing a grenade into the helicopter. The other 3 terrorists that had left the helicopter took off and tried to escape. One of those were killed, 2 were captured. The remaining terrorists, along with the other people that were in the helicopter, one of the remaining terrorists detonated another grenade. So all being said, at 11:15 p.m., the incident had ended with 11 Israel athletes, 1 police officer, and 10 Arab terrorists killed. So how does this roll into Dr. Harvey Schlossberg and, at the time, Lieutenant Frank Boltz? Well, nearly 5 months after Munich took place, Dr. Harvey Schlossberg, who was a detective at the time, 12 years into the job with the NYPD, along with soon to be along with Lieutenant Frank Boltz, who was well known in the tactical area, started to develop this negotiating component. But it was 5 months after Munich that Dr. Schlossberg was called to assist in a situation that involved a hostage situation in January of 1973. He had started to teach classes for the NYPD how to deal with hostage situations by using a non-violent verbal technique that we now call hostage negotiating. He had just started to do that prior to this incident. Now, the NYPD incident, it involved a hostage situation where 1 police officer had already been killed, that several others were pinned down, and it wasn't until several days later of negotiating where these psychological methods that had been taught and utilized by Dr. Schlossberg successfully resolved the situation. And when I say successfully resolved the situation, I mean no one else was injured or killed after negotiations started. So no hostage takers, no hostages, no officers, or innocent bystanders were killed after those negotiations started. Now, Dr. Harvey Schlossberg pulled from psychological literature at the time to develop these principles. There wasn't any real literature out there about hostage negotiating, and he emphasized managing hostage incidents as if the crisis was for the hostage taker. Now, what they stressed, they being Schlossberg and Boltz stressed, was first to contain and negotiate. Secondly, they wanted to try to understand the hostage taker's motivation and personality. And then thirdly, they wanted to focus on slowing down the incident so that time could work for the negotiator, but also ultimately for the hostage taker as well and hostages. So he drew upon his PhD in psychology. He had attended a psychoanalytic training institute that was known as a Freudian analyst. And he was also at the time seeing private patients under some supervision, which included a cross-section population of New York City. His doctorate was focused on ego development, the clinical use of classical projective tests, but his analytical experience dealt with defense mechanisms and motivation, unconscious influences. So these defense mechanisms and unconscious influences such as aggression, conflict resolution, and positive and negative reinforcement are the things that he drew upon. And the result was a theory that was based on problem solving and pleasure seeking based on an individual's interpretation of their reality. ultimately with the understanding that perception is reality. All right, so that brings us to today. I wanted to make sure that I gave the historical context because prior to 1972 and prior to this being an option for police, really they only had a few options. They could go tactical, or they could drive away, or they could wait it out. And so the introduction to de-escalation and attempts to negotiate was a huge leap in the right direction. And ultimately, he said, in terms of hostage negotiating, that there's no such thing as a psycho, that behavior is understandable, goal-oriented, pleasure-seeking, and problem-solving in nature. Now, feel free to laugh at this next clip. It is it is funny to me, but keep in mind when you watch this short clip that behavior is understandable, goal-oriented, pleasure-seeking, and problem-solving in nature, because I want to talk about it afterwards and see if you can pick out what happened here. All right, is there anybody that wants to tell me what just happened?
He couldn't get it to print, so he dragged his computer over there and was like, okay, print it off the screen then.
That's right. That's right, David. Yeah, you know, it's hard for some people to realize that that's what our computers used to look like, but it wasn't that long ago. Um, do you guys think that it was just that led him to drag his monitor over to the scanner to scan it and print it? Are we dealing with a psycho? Are we dealing with some crazy dude?
They're probably dealing with a lot of stuff that came before.
Absolutely. Very good, David. Yeah, one of the first questions that we tend to ask in negotiations is what has happened in the last 24 or 48 hours of this individual's life? There tends to be stress buildup. Ultimately, everybody has some sort of breaking point when there's a significant amount of stressors that have been put on at one given time that the person gets beyond their ability to cope in socially acceptable ways. This is what we tend to see. So he probably was already having a pretty bad day before this, before he went to go try to fix the printer. That's what he tried to fix the first time with his white shirt. And I don't know if you could see it at home, but the ink blew up on his white shirt. And he went into problem solving mode, right? He's got to get that TPS report printed before he goes home. So he went to go get it off his monitor. He can see it on the monitor. We can, this is a depiction of somebody going in crisis. It's pleasure seeking in nature, goal oriented. He's going to get that thing printed. He's going to scan it right off of that bad boy, and he's going to have his TPS report submitted on time. It tends not to be socially acceptable, though. That's what we tend to see in crisis. So let's talk a little bit about crisis. We have this emotional equilibrium component. Now, I borrowed this picture that you see on the right of your screen, where it's talking about stimulation and motivation there in the middle. That tends to be where we usually are in our emotional equilibrium. We tend to wake up in the morning, maybe even a little bit below that, not stressed out, not at all, worried about a few things, but then we might start thinking about, oh crap, I got to do this when I get to work, and I got to do that, and I forgot to pay this bill, and you start getting a little bit jacked up, right? Even to the point where you might get a little bit jacked up on Mountain Dew. But that's not quite crisis. What we're talking about with crisis, the example that I tend to give police officers when I teach this is, okay, so you get to work, you're already a little stressed out from X, Y, and Z, but you're at work, you have the 911 call where you have to respond rapidly. You get there, you deal with the situation, you get back in service, you're a little amped up, but you're starting to come back down. The physiological responses that happens when you have those adrenaline dumps, those kind of things, starts to dissipate. But then you get a call from internal affairs. Now, all police officers and probably everybody on this call knows that when internal affairs calls a police officer, it's not good news. They're not calling them to tell them what a good job they're doing, right? So they're going to be stressed out, whether it's something that they think they may have done or didn't do, or if it was, crap, I got to go to internal affairs again for Jeff, who's always getting me in trouble. That's where they end up going, and they talk to internal affairs, who police the police in an effort to keep them on the moral correct path, ethically, and the moral compass straight and narrow. Now, let's say the officer gets there, and the officer goes in, and the detective there says, hey, Jeff, it's good to see you. I hate that it's on in these circumstances, but we have a complaint that you're on the take. So I just need your gun and badge. We'll be in touch. I'm sure you understand. Go ahead and go home. Where do you think that the officer's mind is right now? Are we doing good? Are we jacked up on Mountain Dew? Stressed out? If you're that officer, even if you're not on the take, which means you're not selling drugs, you're not taking bribes, would you be stressed out more so than you were before you went in there? Well, hopefully you're thinking yes, because you would be regardless, right? So now we have Jeff driving home. He's a little amped up, but not in crisis, just amped up. And he gets home, he pulls into his driveway, and he sees his best friend's John's truck there. And he's like, oh, thank God John is here. I can't believe John's here. How did my best friend John know that I am having the worst day of my life? So he goes inside, and Jeff goes, John, no response. So he starts walking down the hallway, and he sees his bedroom door closed. Goes to open his bedroom door, and inside his bedroom is his best friend and his significant other involved in carnal activity. Just in case I have some children online. Where do you think our police officer is now? What do you think our police officer would do? What would you do if you're the police officer? Or let's put it this way. Let's say you have a friend. If you have a friend, what would your friend do in this situation?
They'd snap.
They'd snap.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So like maybe looking for a baseball bat, maybe they've got a backup weapon there, maybe they've got an ankle holster where they carry their secondary weapon. All of those things would be going into crisis. It is problem solving. It's not socially acceptable problem solving. Now, depending on what plays out at that point, probably going to go to court. Would some people on the jury understand, or at least get where the guy's coming from that snapped? Yeah, probably, but it's still not going to behoove them in the long run. Now, if we could be emotionless, if we were creatures that, those kind of stressors, we could just, no big deal. The rational thing is to pull out your cell phone, videotape, take pictures, and walk away. Because the long-term effect's going to be, all right, this is going to work out better in court. Alimony's probably going to be out the window at this point. John really isn't my best friend, nor is my significant other really into me anymore anyway, right? So if we're thinking about it rationally, which we are emotional beings. And that's one of those things that every decision we make tends to have some level of emotion attached to it. For us to understand that as negotiators, that's key, right? Because we know that just because John was there, or Jeff did what Jeff did while he was in crisis, doesn't make Jeff a bad guy. Now, we don't agree with the actions that Jeff took, or we may agree with some of them, like, holy crap, Jeff, I totally get, why you picked up the baseball bat. But right now, John in there is bleeding. And if we could get him outside and get him help, then he's not going to be your problem anymore. Right. So go ahead and, send John on out so we can take care of John, and we'll keep talking. Right. So there's things like that we do because we have general concern and genuine concern for all the people involved, and not just the hostages. It's the hostage taker too, that, what they did in crisis is not probably what they typically do. Now, the way that Scotland Yard was teaching this back in, it's been about 10 years now, so I'm not entirely sure that they're still using Maslow's pyramid, but part of their method was to identify when somebody goes into Jenga, right? And if you don't know Jenga, I don't know that there's an app for this. There probably is. So I've got a short clip by Ricky Bobby, Talladega Nights, is going to show us what Jenga is. All right, so an attempt at some humor with Ricky Bobby here, but also, holy crap. Now, we call that the double whammy in negotiating, because what happened in a very short amount of time was Ricky Bobby both lost his job and at least the perception, if not for real, his significant other, right? All within a very short amount of time. That tends to put a lot of people in crisis. And that's something that we see with Jenga. So with Jenga, what Scotland Yard teaches is, okay, let's look at what's been impacted in the last 24, 48 hours. For Ricky Bobby, was his self-esteem, confidence, or respect of others, respect by others impacted? Now, if you've not seen the movie, he was a race car driver and always came in first. And if, he believed in, if you're not first, you're last. Was that respect by others impacted in the last, at least in his perception? Because that's what is reality. What is his perception? Well, we know his family definitely was impacted, even though the kids are trying to take the best out of it. 2 Christmases, right? The safety component. We know that his employment, just in that short clip, gone, right? He'd been fired. So that block comes out. And at some point you get Jenga. Now, different people are resilient in different ways, with social networks, with coping mechanisms, and all sorts of different things that take place. But everybody has a breaking point. Okay, so now one of the things that we're seeing in law enforcement, in the news, is this component of when we go tactical, right? So how often do you think, if let's say we have a hostage or barricaded situation, what do you think the percentage of injury or death will be when we go tactical?
You mean the possibility of it happening?
The percentage of injury or death with anybody that's involved with it. So, our hostages, our hostage taker, our SWAT team, when they go in, what are the chances, and what's the proportion of cases where somebody gets seriously injured, where an ambulance has to come at the very least and take care of it? You think it's high?
Very
Low?
high, I would think.
Very high? Okay. Anybody else? That's good, David. Anybody want to put a percent on that?
50%.
50%. Okay, that's a really good guess. Yeah, definitely. So the HOBUS, this is collected by the FBI, and it's in a voluntary kind of way. It stands for Hostage or Barricaded Incident Statistics. Based on the last reports that I had access to a few years ago, it was 78%. And it's not varied a whole lot over the years. Sometimes it's 79%. but it is very high, like David said, and it's definitely above that 50% mark where somebody is physically injured or killed when we go tactical. So 78% of the time, and this includes our hostages, this includes our hostage taker, and this includes our own police officers and bystanders. So really high. Now, let's say we decide, let's use sniper fire. What do you think the chances are of somebody getting seriously injured or killed with that?
I mean, if the sniper actually was I mean, did what the snipers do, then it's very high because someone's getting shot.
Absolutely. Very good, David. We don't tend to pick the worst shot to be the sniper on the team. They tend to be really good shots. A lot of them have military experience as snipers. They are, for lack of better words, deadly accurate, right? So I've seen this range between 99% and all the way to 100% that somebody gets seriously injured or killed. Now, unfortunately, it's not always the intended target. There's a case, it's quite a few years old, but it took place at a Good Guys store where the sniper fire was supposed to coincide with the dynamic entry of the tactical team from the rear of the store. And unfortunately, in this case, one of the hostage takers was opening the door at the time the shot was taken, deflecting the round enough to not strike the intended target, and creating the chain of events that played out, which the tactical team got in there a few seconds behind that shot being taken, and multiple lives were lost. So it's not always a boom, got the bad guy, and everybody else is safe kind of approach. All right, so now what do you think with negotiations? When we use negotiations, what do you think the percent of or portion of cases where somebody gets seriously injured or killed?
You mean that end with negotiations, that are concluded with negotiations and nothing else, no tactical, nothing else?
Yep, where we don't have to use a tactical response, that we use negotiations. What's the percent of somebody being injured or killed when we use negotiations?
15%.
I like it, Bill. 15%. It's actually lower than that. 5% of the time, somebody is seriously injured or killed when we use negotiations. So, another way of looking at this, negotiations are 95% effective in keeping the officers, our victims, our suspects, our bystanders all alive and not seriously injured. Because unfortunately, we do have the high percent of somebody getting seriously injured or killed when we have to go tactical. Now, that doesn't mean that we can handle everything through negotiations, because that's not the case, unfortunately. But we have seen a lot of cases where negotiations are effective in de-escalating our offender or our barricaded subject, our person in crisis, to the point where they can make socially acceptable decisions. Okay, so why waste the time talking? Well, that's part of the reason. There's also a case, US versus Downs, where we're supposed to use reasonable approaches prior to using deadly force as well, which is a case example that a case that I'll just throw out there that people are aware of, that it's there. But I wanted you guys to listen to a gentleman trying to negotiate and listen to what he does good, and then listen to what he can improve on, and we're going to talk about it.
Hello. Yeah, this is Lieutenant Connor again. We're trying to get the for you. We're trying to get the money. Right. Now, how much time have we got? 5 after 1? Right. Okay, what are you going to do if we can't make it by 5 after 1? Well, try it. No, don't put me on that. Hello. Hello. Yeah, this is Lieutenant Connor again. You in there by yourself with that hostage, or you got another participant in this robbery? You got another guy in there with you? Huh? I'm all by myself. Let me talk to the hostage again, huh? Okay. It'll only take a minute. Hold on a second. Hey, well, before you go, you still there? Nita? This is Lieutenant Connor again. How many people are in that bank? Just the two of you? There's no other man in there. Okay, let me talk to him again before you hang up, will you?
Right here.
Are you still there?
Yes.
Look, what are you going to do now? You're going to kill her if we don't have that money by 5 after, because we're scraping it as fast as we can, but time is of the essence for us, too.
Of the essence for me, too. Just go ahead and keep scraping.
Well, no, what are you going to do? I mean, what are you going to do at 1 o'clock?
Keep scraping.
Is it your intention to kill this girl?
Scraping. Look, you people be reasonable with me. I'll be reasonable with you. Okay? I don't want to hurt anybody, right? On the other hand, I'm not going to go to jail either.
Is there any other kind of deal we can make with you? You know, come 5 after.
The one we're in the process of making.
No, I'm saying about time. We intend to get the money in the car, but what I'm saying is if it takes us a little longer than that, will you give us the time that we need?
A little time, not a hell of a lot.
Well, would you give us another 20 minutes? Because we're really doing the best we can, but another 20 minutes would help us if you'll give us till 1:30, will you? We'll try and get it there by 5 after. If I can't by 5 after, I'll call you. But stretch it out till 1:30, will you?
Yeah, you deal with me, pal.
I will. I'll deal with you.
Okay.
Just hang in there, okay? You give us till 1:30?
Against my better judgment, I'll give you till 1:30.
Okay.
But I'm getting a little frustrated now.
I don't blame you.
Tired, okay?
Okay.
Regardless of how this thing concludes and how it ends, I want to get it over with.
Yeah, so do we. But we want to get it over with without you getting hurt and without that girl getting hurt.
Precisely. That's how I want to get it over with. Okay?
Yeah. Are you getting hungry?
I don't want any food delivered.
You don't want any food?
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else we can get for you?
You're doing the best you can.
You're right.
You got.
Okay.
Keep on trucking.
Okay. All right. We'll call you back.
Right.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Cut number.
Okay, so how did he do? What would he, or anything bad or things that he could work on, improve on our negotiator, or
Ben,
anything? Go
should
ahead.
he not have started it out? I mean, I don't know if this was the start, but with, instead of kind of trying to tell or inform the hostage taker what they want, what, you know, how it was going to work, he kind of was almost opening the door to allowing him to run the show, so to speak.
Yeah, David, that's good. Yeah, well, we definitely want to hear back. I mean, part of this is this active listening, because we do want the subject event. We do want, in the process of that and hearing what their reality is to establish this rapport. Part of it is stalling for time, but not because we're playing some sort of game. We genuinely are trying to help the person that's in crisis, even our hostage taker as well. Because once those emotions, the physiological, the psychological components can dissipate some, we tend to make better decisions. So one of the things that he did, probably not a good thing, was labeling the people in there as hostages. That we don't know, this is taken out of context. It may have already been the case where the subject had said multiple times that the people were hostages, but we still want to focus on them as human beings and make sure that they're not being dehumanized. And that's one of the fears that we would have with this. So great answer, David. Anybody else? What else? Anything good, bad?
Margot made a point in the chat. She said it seemed like he was pushing the man to a decision that might not be good. However, he did get him to agree to a small thing.
Okay. All right, good. The probably not worded the best. I mean, definitely not worded the best. What he was trying to do is to get reassurance that nobody's going to get harmed. But what he did in the process of that is he actually set a deadline, and we don't want to set deadlines. We don't want our hostage taker to set deadlines. So that's a problem that we probably created in the situation. So that's a really good response by Margot. Anything else?
I feel that it was good that he tried to meet his needs, offering him food, asking if there was anything that he needed.
Good, Catherine. Absolutely. Yeah, no, that was really good. What I'm And that's going to lead me into this, because that's a really good observation that you're making. The situation, the issue with this is a big part of our communication comes across in tone of voice, specifically when it's just the phone that the person has to hear us through. This, I think he even refers to himself as Lieutenant Connor, if I remember right. He uses his title. So it's really important that we're interacting with our person as another human being, and that we're genuine, and our tone of voice reflects that we're not taking this authoritative figure approach that we that's the hat that we wear most of the time as police officers. It's really hard as police officers to, I found this whole put on the negotiator hat thing never translated in the classroom, never really worked when I was trying to teach new officers how to be negotiators. And eventually I would make them wear a light switch around their neck. And if it was on, they were thinking as a cop, which keeps them alive, keeps them coming home at night, thinking tactically. But when officers have the time, the cover, like they're not in the line of fire, they're not going to be physically hurt, and also have the distance, what they need to do is learn how to flip that switch off, that cop switch, and be a human being again, and interact with the other human being as a human being. And it's really difficult for police officers to do this, especially because every call they go on, there's a gun. They're bringing a gun to every call. So you already have a gun at the scene. You have to think tactically. You don't know what weapons they have. You typically don't know the history. But when you have the time, cover, and distance, and you're able to flip that switch off as the cop and pull from an area of patience and understanding as another human being, and use this thing called active listening along with emotional intelligence, you're able to help this person. In particular, when you use that proper tone of voice that you're pointing to, that, yeah, he said the right things, but how he said it may not have been the most genuine way to make the hostage taker feel like he actually cares, right? So it's not just a matter of it's not a game. And that's a hard thing for new negotiators to learn, that it's not some strategy game that we're trying to hoodwink somebody and trick somebody, that it really is about de-escalating their emotions, giving them time to sort through what brought them there that day, what led to that, and have them come up with some solutions of how to deal with it. So how do we get there? What I've been talking about is this active listening component. I have a short clip, but I'm just going to explain it to you for time purposes. That if you've ever seen the old show, Everybody Loves Raymond, he's in this parenting class, and the instructor is trying to teach him or try to teach active listening instead of just straight punishment, instead of negative reinforcement, which is something that Dr. Harvey Schlossberg really unpacked right away with this whole concept. Active listening is so important to negotiations that the last time that I did negotiating training with the FBI, they would spend in their basic training an 8-hour day just on this component. So 1 day out of 5 just on active listening. That's how important it is that you're actively listening to what the person's saying. It's not about saying the right thing. It's about hearing what the person's saying and listening to the emotions, and then paraphrasing back to them what you think they're saying, because their perception and your perception as the negotiator may not be matching up right away, or even, hours into it. So this active listening component is highly important. Also highly important is this component of emotion. So let me play this though. The way we use this clip, and it's a good point as far as their reality, right? And that's something that's really hard for a negotiator to take on board. The reality of the person that they're talking to, that's what matters, no matter what. And that's what you're trying to get to, right? And in order to get to the problem, you've got to get through the emotions. The emotions are key, right? And in this case, the reality, at least for her, is it's not about the nail. And that's the reality that matters when it comes to negotiations. So what we do then ultimately here is this negotiation process that all takes time. This is the behavioral staircase that new negotiators and trained negotiators utilize to draw from. But the real key to this is this active listening component, this trying to get where somebody's coming from. You can't fully understand them. That's not the purpose. We're not trying to understand everything about them, but we do want to try to get where they're coming from and get the emotions. And when we're able to reflect back what they're saying that's bothering them, then what that does is it shows them empathy. And by showing them empathy, gains some rapport in that process to eventually, over time, which it varies, like I said, with my master's thesis, I noticed a correlation with violent offenders where it took 3 times as long to negotiate with them and get through this negotiation process to affect behavioral change and have the person surrender or have the person let the people out of the house, the bank, whatever it is, and then surrender. So that's the NYPD has a full-time hostage negotiating team. Talk to Me is what they tend to go by. That's a site that I'll wrap up with today, where you can go to and get your own resources to help somebody in crisis, even if it's yourself, with phone numbers and resources. But ultimately, to sum up today's overview of what hostage negotiating is this: when it comes to people being held against their will, that's when we start getting in the realm of a hostage situation, that they're being used as a bargaining chip. But we also have to deal with the crisis component of the hostage taker. So barricaded subjects, we still have to work through this crisis intervention component, because we know, yeah, we can send the tactical team in, but there's a high chance somebody's going to get seriously injured or killed. And the way to do all of this is through this active listening. It's key to get the subject to vent about what their reality is. And in the process of doing that, you gain genuine trust and ultimate this. Think about if you were holding people, or even if you were in crisis initially and you've been talking with a negotiator for hours and you're starting to think the way you typically think before you went into crisis. And you're looking out your window and you see 8 Ninja Turtles behind a tree that look like they're getting ready to stomp you as soon as you come out. How comfortable are you going to be to walk out that front door? And that's a big part of how we, and things that we have to tackle as a negotiator, is not just this component of dealing with somebody that's in crisis, but there's a lot to it, right? And I've tried to give an overview of that component. But hostage negotiating is the most effective tool to save lives. And that's where I wanted to make sure that I wrapped up on this slide, which is the NYPD news site, Talk to Me. It's got a list of different sites from the National Alliance on Mental Illness that helps with teaching officers across the United States crisis intervention. Officers become crisis intervention team members through this organization. And then we also have other things like the crisis text line now, which is something relatively new. So any questions, concerns, comments? I'm sorry that I came right up to the 6 o'clock moment, but anybody, questions, discussion?